So we left off last time. We had been talking about Michelangelo and his work at the Campidoglio, one of the most important works of his for urban planning, but also, essentially designing and overseeing the construction of St. Peter's, which was based on the plan by Bramante, but had Michelangelo modified the plan somewhat and then implemented the construction of it, including the dome of that. There's even more St. Peter's to come. We're not done talking about St. Peter's for sure, and we're not quite done talking about Michelangelo. The last building I want to discuss that he was involved with is one of the most important Renaissance palazzos, and therefore one of the most important Renaissance buildings, and that is the Palazzo Farnese. This is in Rome, built between 1517 and finished by 1546. The primary architect was Antonio da Sangallo the Younger. We talked about Sangallo Senior. He had some plans and designs for St. Peter's that were not implemented. In fact, Michelangelo was, rejected Sangallo's plan and didn't like them at all, and did something completely different. Sangallo was a fairly well-known Renaissance architect, but his son was also very talented and became an architect on his own and was the primary architect for Palazzo Farnese, and then Michelangelo got involved a little later doing some modifications and updates. This would really be considered sort of the high point of the Renaissance here, the really refined and sophisticated palace design here. This is the exterior front facade. And like the earlier palazzos we saw in Florence, like the Medici and Risalto, this has a three-story, three-partite or tripartite design element. So we have a base right down along here that actually has a different material. This is kind of a rough stucco. It's not quite that really rough rusticated stone that we saw at the Palazzo Medici, but it's a very rough base. The second level here, a nice belt course that defines each level. Second level is a much smoother stucco finish. And then the third level, same thing. It's got the wide projecting cornice that we saw in the Florence palaces. And then the windows are traditional Renaissance windows. We have pilasters on the sides. And then we have, at least on the second floor, we've got the triangle and circular pediments over them. On the third floor, just a broken triangular pediment. A broken pediment means that it doesn't have that line coming across the bottom all the way, so it's just returns a little bit. Where compare that to the full triangular line at the bottom on the second floor. It has a very prominent entrance with a Roman arch, a little more not quite rusticated stone, but like we saw in some of the Florence palazzos, it has those really deep recessed joints in the stones that kind of make them look a little bit more like rusticated elements. This is, really, like I say, one of the most famous Renaissance palazzos. It's on a prominent piazza in Rome. It actually serves as the French embassy now. You can see the French flag there at the entrance. I think they, of course, not with the pandemic, but for a long time, because it was an embassy, you couldn't really go in, take a tour or anything like that, of course, unless you were a French citizen. You could go at least into the lobby. But I think more recently, they've started at least opening it up for tours, not into some of the depths of the buildings, but at least into the courtyard or something like that. But I haven't had a chance to do that. It's on my bucket list to try to actually get inside here one day. So here's the floor plan. This is also similar to the planning that we saw of the Florence palazzos. Here's the facade down at the bottom, the primary front entrance right here. That leads into a vestibule, kind of this colonnaded vestibule, and then into this inner courtyard or atrium. Again, very similar to the way even ancient Roman houses were planned. And the courtyard has a loggia or arcade that goes all the way around an open court here in the center. And when you live in a temperate climate like Rome, the rooms can be all around the perimeter, and you can walk in this covered loggia as your circulation. So you don't have hallways the way we would think of in a house today. It's, you know, open into this private courtyard. And of course, all of this is private so that the perimeter walls are you don't necessarily need as many windows. Things can look inward for privacy and security. Again, if you're wealthy in this era, you know, the mob might rise up and try to usurp your power or something like that if they get angry at the wealthy, which happens every so often, right? And so it's good to be in a palace that has some security. All right, so this is the inner courtyard, and this was actually the part that Michelangelo worked on in 1546. So Sangolo the Younger had begun building the exterior elements of the palace. I think he may have died, I'm not sure. And then Michelangelo took over in 1546 to finish off the interior. And again, we're seeing classic Renaissance elevations here, very much tied back to the Colosseum like we talked about before, where we have on the ground level is the Doric order, the second level is the Ionic order, and the third level up here has a Corinthian pilasters. If I had gotten the Lego Colosseum set for Christmas, I could have built that and showed you the comparison because it actually shows the three orders even in the Lego set, but I didn't. So unfortunately, you'll just have to take my word for it. But anyway, this is classical Renaissance, you know, tying back to the three levels and the three orders that we saw at the Colosseum. And again, the triangle and half circle pediments, and even a little on the second level here, and certainly on the first level, the open loggia with Roman arches, and on the second level, sort of these arched openings with the windows sort of built in between there. So this really is classical high Renaissance, sort of the climax of Renaissance design. Okay, so that we'll finish up with Michelangelo there. The next person I want to talk about is one of the most important architects we're going to talk about this semester, and we're going to reference Palladio a lot. I will, yeah, I'm only half joking when I tell students that if there is a doubt, if you're on, being asked a question on a quiz or on the midterm exam, and you're not sure the answer, you might as well guess Palladio. I don't want to just tell you that and, you know, have you be wrong, but you know, if you got to guess anyway, you might be, you know, might have to stand a good chance to guess Palladio. He's an important Renaissance architect, and he is one of the most influential architects for generations, for centuries. Just about almost every classical inspired building that comes after the Renaissance owes a debt to Palladio and his work. I'm going to show you several examples of his work. Some of them are just really critical and important. Some of them just to give you a little flavor of the kind of things he was doing. He lived between 1508 and 1580, so kind of a long life. During the height, the 1500s, the 16th century is really the height, the climax of the Renaissance period. So he is kind of coming at the tail end of this. So he's an innovator, but obviously he's building upon the early Renaissance works and designs of the legends before him, and he masters this. I mean, you know, he's really considered one of the greatest architects that ever lived. And he had a quote, which I think is a pretty cool quote for an architect. Vitruvius is my master, Rome is my mistress, and architecture is my life. So, you know, if you become a great architect, you better have a sort of a quote or you know, a theme that you live by, and this was Vitruvius's. One of the reasons why he becomes so critical and so inspirational to later generations is because he wrote a book called The Four Books of Architecture, or Quattro Libri, in 1570. And this highlighted his philosophy about what made good architecture, all based on classical inspirations of antiquity, ancient Rome especially, but it also highlighted a lot of his works, plans and elevations and drawings and renderings of his works. It's basically almost like a monograph. You know, today, you know, an architect that you really like that's pretty famous, you can go go to a bookstore, or since you're a different generation than I am, you go online and Amazon or whatever, and you order, this monograph book, and it's got these beautiful pictures and plans and renderings. This is really one of the first examples of that. And so it wasn't just a philosophy of architecture that Alberti had written about and Vitruvius had written about. It really showed images of his architecture. And so later generations of architects could look through this book and go, I really like this. I'm going to design something like it. And we're going to see this over and over and over again happening. By the way, Palladio wasn't even his real name. It was actually a nickname by one of his clients, Gian Giorgio Trissino, and he had written a poem, Italy Freed from the Goths, great Renaissance kind of title there, and Palladio was the hero, and so, the name Palladio stuck there. So Palladio was basically worked in northern Italy around Venice and Vicenza. This is in the territory of Venice at the time, the Republic of Venice. Venice was an extremely wealthy city-state that was involved with seafaring and trade. It obviously is famous as being built basically in the water, on stilts, right? And all the canals and so forth. And so they were seafaring people, and that meant that they were traders, especially with the Eastern Mediterranean. And the Eastern Mediterranean was sort of like the last link to the Far East trading, Marco Polo going to China, bringing back the spices and stuff from the Orient. They wound up passing through Venice, and so there was an immense amount of wealth in Venice. And as we talked about last time, if you were a wealthy person, you had your city palace, but then you might also want a country palace. And Palladio became very known for building country palaces. But the first thing I want to talk about is 1549. This is known as the Basilica in Vicenza. And really, it's a market hall. So if you told me it's the market hall, I'll probably give you credit for that as well. But they called it the Basilica. So it also has some associations there, name-wise, to the ancient Roman basilicas. But it basically served as a market hall where vendors could set up shops and so forth. And in the 19th century, this green roof here up at the top was added on. So that's a later addition. If you just sort of ignore that, what we're really looking at here is the facade. And because it's a market hall, it's more of an open building. It's not an enclosed with windows and doors and so forth. The idea is it's shelter for the market stalls inside, but it's otherwise kind of left open so people could kind of easily come and go. And you can kind of see some of the storefronts and things on the inside here. But this is, somewhat based on the idea of a Renaissance palazzo. This is only 2 stories high, so you have a strong entablature belt course and then a cornice line up here. But a very solid use of the classical orders. Again, very proportional. Here's your Doric order on the ground floor, Ionic on the second. Doesn't have a 3rd floor, so we don't see the Corinthian order here. But even the Doric order, look at the entablature above that. It's got the triglyphs and metopes, and then a more Ionic classical entablature above that with a little cornice line. And then the upper part here of the roof was just an open balustrade, something that we haven't seen in earlier palazzos. We saw these projecting cornices. Now we see a balustrade. That's something we're going to see again and again. But the most important thing here really are the openings. I won't call them windows, they're not, they're openings. They're sort of based, right, on a Roman triumphal arch, and we even saw this used at the Palazzo Uffizi in Florence by Vasari. But we have this, tall Roman arched opening at the center, and then on the sides are smaller sort of openings that are, divided by these classical columns. We can see them both on both levels. Up here on the second level, you can almost see better. There's an opening on the side here. And this becomes a trademark of Palladio. He doesn't invent it, but this opening shape becomes something he uses again and again. And because he used it, the people that follow him use it, and this becomes known as the Palladian window. If you've heard that term before, that's what we're talking about. So it's referring to Palladio. He uses that really for the first time at the Basilica in Vicenza. And the Palladian window has been used ever since. These are just images that I pulled off of the internet here of different types of windows. Some of them are quite traditional. If you look in the upper left here, this is a true neoclassical Palladian window. You notice it's got the tall center with the Roman arch, and then it's got columns and the little windows on the side. This one here in the middle, upper middle, is pretty traditional too. It just has a broken pediment that goes over the top of that. The one on the upper right is, you know, the exact form. It even has kind of a pilaster with flutes. It just doesn't have quite the fancy surround and entablatures. You know, more modern, this is kind of a colonial revival house in the lower left or middle left center, but you can see the same type of thing. You can see lots of Palladian windows in the center, and even modern houses, right? You know, this is a contractor built, house out in the suburbs, and this is a Palladian window. It's a really simplified version of it, but there you go. Same thing with this lower left. You know, Pella, this, I don't know if this is Pella or Anderson, one of the window manufacturers. This is their image of, hey, this is the interior of building a Palladian window. And you can even go crazy, this, I like this lower right one here, where it's essentially a Palladian one. You got the tall center arch, and then you can put little arches on the sides and multiply that. This is where you took you go crazy, right? You got a catalog and you just start adding pieces and pieces and pieces. So Bea asked, is does the Palladian window have some functionality? It's a design aesthetic for sure. Usually the center window in a traditional Palladian window might be operable, but if you actually look at, say, this one here in the center left, that's a fixed window, so you could have sort of a larger fixed window that's going to let in more light, and then you could have smaller windows on the sides that would be operable to let in more ventilation. That's not unusual to have. A smaller window is easier to operate than a very large window traditionally. Or they could be fixed. They can, in a modern window, they could be casements, and you can do all sorts of kind of weird things. But it's the form that is the real thing that makes it a Palladian window. It has to have that center element with the arch on top and the two narrower side windows they're not as tall. And traditionally, sort of classical features to it, but nowadays you just see the shape. You don't even see the classical elements. Okay, so let's talk about some of the other buildings that he worked on. One of this is the Villa Barbaro. This is in a little village called Mazar, 1557-58 by Palladio. And this is a really traditional villa design. Palladio is best known for his villas. These are the country estates of very wealthy Venetians typically. And so this has a few things that I want to point out, both aesthetically, but also the planning. And this is something that his plans become very important too. If we look at the plan on top here, we see it's a kind of almost H shape. We have a central pavilion that extends out the front here. Then we have kind of a loggia with rooms along the back, and that sort of links to two wings on either side. And the wings are probably servant spaces. This looks like almost a horse stable over here. There might have been kitchens or something on the other side, but the primary family spaces would have been off the main walkway here in the center. There is a walled garden in the back with an archway that kind of, creates an interesting curved design. And then even in the front, the courtyard has a curved garden wall that comes around with just an opening, to walk or drive in on your horse or buggy. And then there's some more simple courtyards off to the sides here. If we look at the elevation, we see that reflected very clearly. Here is the front entrance portico. You can just make out that it looks like a Roman temple front. That is pretty traditional Renaissance, but also very much Palladian. the idea of really putting a temple front on the building. You can see the arched loggias going along the side here, and just sort of more simplified. Look at this. This is the two ends. That kind of reminds you, I hope, of Santa Maria Novella by Alberti, where we have the sort of wide base, we have this sort of Roman temple front on top, and look, a little curved element. Maybe not the scrolls, but at least that curved element like Alberti had introduced at Santa Maria Novella in Florence. So here is an image of the villa itself, and it becomes a little more clear here, I think, of what we're talking about. So very much a Roman temple front. Now, you know, it's a house, it's not a Roman temple, so we have things like walls and windows and so forth, but we have a very classical pediment and cornice line. We have an Ionic order, very scaled and proportioned. And then we see the Renaissance window heads, the circle and triangle pediments over the windows. And then the Roman arched loggia on the sides. And like I say, here's that little temple front on the side here, wing with that curved feature that is sort of taking its inspiration from Alberti. And we can kind of compare this to a classical Roman temple, the most intact one probably being the Maison Carré. This is in Nîmes, France, from the year 2 CE. And you know, these Renaissance architects, this is the sort of things that they were looking at, you know, either personally on trips and visits, or you know, through publications that are becoming more common in the Renaissance. And so you know, this is a true Roman temple, and so it does have walls for the temple inside, but you know, they're not windows, it's not a house. So the Renaissance is about taking this and converting it into something more like this. So it's not an exact replica, it's an inspiration, but doing so in what they saw as a fairly authentic manner with the scales and proportions. All right, so Palladio's most famous work, without a doubt, is the Villa Rotonda. This is in Vicenza, dates from 1566, finished in 1570. And kind of a simple name, known as the Rotunda because it had, that's not the family, it's because it has this grand rotunda space inside the house. This was built to be a party house. The family, you know, they were wealthy Venetians, and they wanted this country house outside of Vicenza, and they wanted to entertain here. They wanted to throw big, lavish parties to entertain and impress their friends and colleagues and so forth. It is situated very dramatically on top of a hill, so it sort of crowns the hill and dominates the view from all around. So as you're approaching as a guest, you would be, in theory, very impressed. Up the hill, and at the top you see this grand palace sitting up here. You'll notice it's a square building. We've seen two sides here. All four sides are equal. They're all exactly the same, and they all have a Roman temple front as the entrance portico. As you can see, it's an Ionic order. You can see the classical pediment and entablatures up here. You can clearly see Ionic order. This is, you know, similar to the Villa in which he's put her temple front on the front, except he's doing it 4 times here. And you can see very clearly the dome that caps off the rotunda inside. He's expressing the building pretty clearly on the exterior. You can read it to know pretty much what's happening on the interior. And this is more of a dome based on the Pantheon dome. It's not the big, tall, vaulted dome that we saw in Florence or at the Vatican. This is more of a Pantheon-based dome. Here is a view straight on as you would approach for a party. If you were invited, you would be riding up in your carriage and your gown and, you know, fancy suit or whatever. And this would be the view you have. You know, it really looks monumental, this grand staircase leading up. This is really meant to impress, right? This is meant to wow people. Um, and you know, you see this grand entry door hidden in behind here with a pediment over that. There's sculptures on the tops of the building and out here in the garden. Everything is meant here to wow and to impress. So in plan, like I say, it's a square with the four porticos, the four temple front porticos off the side. Each has this grand staircase, and the main at the center is the rotunda, hence the name. This grand space that is, you know, 2.5 stories tall with a dome. I mean, it's a very impressive space. And then there's parlors and fancy rooms, dining rooms, and so forth off to the side. Because this is just a getaway house, a party house, there isn't a ton of living space here. There's some bedrooms up on the second floor for overnight guests and so forth, and some servant and kitchen spaces down in the basement. But for the most part, this is really meant to be a entertaining house, not the place where they lived 24/7. Here is a cutaway section to give you a little sense of it. So you can see, let's look over here on the right, you can kind of see the grand staircase coming up to the temple portico, and you walk through the doorway through kind of a vestibule into this grand rotunda space that you can see is vertical with the spherical Pantheon-based dome at the very top. And then down below are the servant wings for the kitchens and servant quarters. And then up above, a little smaller, not quite as grandiose, are some bedroom wings for overnight stays. So here's another view of that. Again, very dramatically set up on the side here. And here's a view of the rotunda space. So this is mostly frescoed with what we call faux bois, and we've seen a few examples like with Alberti, where he kind of created that entire altar area, right, in faux fresco. So these are all faux columns and entablatures here, done very realistically and with great perspective, and meant to kind of give you an impression of this grander space than it is. And then there is a balustrade up here at the top, so if you're at a party, you can stand on the balcony up here looking down at the partiers down below there. It's a really dramatic and incredible space, and this was widely published. This was in his book, and has been an inspiration to architects ever since the 1570s. Another, speaking of his client Trissino, that had kind of gave him his nickname of Palladio. This is Trissino's villa, and this is based also on the Villa Rotunda. You can see that he's basically replicating the Villa Rotunda. Here's the square plan. There's the four porticos sort of on each side. He makes a few modifications to it. It's not an exact copy. There's the dome in the center and so forth. But what's also significant about the Villa Trissino is this immense loggia that comes out in colonnade that really just spreads out from the front entrance and creates this dramatic courtyard out front. We're going to see this over and over again in big royal palaces like Versailles and in country estates, you know, in England and so forth. So all of this is really, really critical stuff. The last major work I want to talk about with Palladio is San Giorgio Maggiore. This is in Venice from 1565. And it is located on an island just off of the Grand Canal, where it empties out, and the Piazza San Marco, the Church of San Marco. So if you stand there, you could, and the Piazza San Marco, one of those big spots, gathering spots in Venice, you look out across the bay to this little island, to San Giorgio Maggiore. And we have here a pretty traditional Renaissance church, Basilica church. You can see it has a dome at the crossing, pretty traditional now for any Renaissance church worth its weight. It's got to have a dome at the crossing. So that's nothing exciting to talk about anymore. Here's the bell tower, the campanile, that's pretty traditional in Italy. But what is significant here at San Giorgio Maggiore is the facade. So we saw several examples of how architects have tried to treat this facade in the past, where you have the taller central element with the tall nave, and then the shorter but wider element that covers the aisles in front. And we saw examples in which architects placed a little Roman temple on the upper part. But what Palladio does here is he actually makes the entire center section one tall Roman temple. And the wider element actually becomes subservient to this center temple front and is sort of set back from that. And what you really see is more of this central bay here that becomes one tall Roman temple. So he's really transposing two elements over top of each other. It's a really creative approach, even possibly even more creative than Alberti at Santa Maria Novella. Here's a sort of side view of that, and you can see how the temple front at the center projects forward of the temple element here that's in the wider part. Excuse me, get some water. The temple in the back has flat pilasters, very Corinthian order. The temple at the center has more, they're engaged, but they're more rounded, you know, almost full three-quarters columns, drums, shafts, really, really tall bases here. This is, you know, exaggerated in scale almost. Proportionally, it's good to classical temple column elements and orders, but it is really exaggerated in scale here. But he needs to do that because of this center element. And if we, again, one more time, if we go back to that proto-Renaissance facade, San Miniato al Monte in Florence from the 11th century, you can see how far we've gone, right? You know, this had been an inspiration for the early Renaissance architects, for Alberti at Santa Maria Novella. This is almost a Roman temple sitting on the top part here, and this sort of Roman arcade at the bottom. But now with Palladio, we see kind of the last evolution of this scheme where the entire section and the front middle becomes one large Roman temple, and the second one transposed behind that's somewhat subservient to it. A much more creative and in some ways effective design approach, and quite famous for that. And again, at this point, you know, the Catholic Church, they're not worried at all about associating themselves with a Roman pagan temple. You know, paganism is long gone. So you would have never seen this in an early Christian church, this sort of direct association with a Roman temple. But by the Renaissance, everybody wants to associate. Excuse me. Oh, got a scratch in my throat. Sorry about that. So here's an interior view of a pretty traditional Renaissance church interior. We see plain Roman vaulted arches. We see classical pilasters and columns and entablatures. And here's the dome. We see the drum of the dome with a classical, or entablature or classical pilasters, and you can't see the rounded dome itself, but you get the feeling this is very, very different from Gothic architecture that we saw last semester. Really briefly, just want to show you a couple of other examples. Venice, this is the Library of St. Mark's, or San Marco, from the 1536 to 1553. The architect was Jacopo Sansovino. This is located just off of the Piazza San Marco. So here is the San Marco, or St. Mark's Church. This is a famous late Gothic Italian. This is the piazza. The famous bell tower or campanile is right here, and it has this L-shaped piazza. So if you're standing in this part of the piazza right here and you're looking down, the San Giorgio Maggiore is on the island way down further at the bottom here. And the Doge's Palace is off of San Marco right here. The library facade is this element right in this area here. So it's a very prominent location on the most prominent element of Venice. So there's the Campanile Tower, and here is the facade of the Library of San Marco. And you see a little bit of the more Gothic, the Venetian Gothic architecture of the Doge's Palace here on the far right. So you can see it's an open colonnade, very similar to that almost of the Basilica Market Hall in Vicenza by Palladio, where we have a classical order on the top and bottom. We have a colonnade or balustrade, excuse me, on the top instead of a heavy projecting cornice, and almost a Palladian window here on the second floor. It's really narrow between that column. Let's see if there's a better view of it. This might show us a little better view. It's very much based on the Basilica at Vicenza by Palladio. So he's already being quite influential, even in the Renaissance, and of course later it will be. Here's a great view. This is now almost from the perspective of San Giorgio Maggiore, looking back at Piazza San Marco. The Doge's Palace, the Venetian Gothic, is on the right, and the library is this little segment right here on the left. And we see a lot of these palazzos in Venice. This is on the Grand Canal. This is the Palazzo Grimani. And we see the same kinds of Venetian and very Palladian architecture here on this palazzo. And this would become even influential in the 19th century in places like New York City with cast iron facades that are very Renaissance inspired, where you have, rusticated stone, you have pedimented entablatures over windows and stuff, but all done in cast iron in the 19th century. And you see these, especially in New York and Soho. This is a photo I took walking around Soho. You see a little bit, not so much cast iron in facades in Chicago, but other cities from the 19th century often will have neighborhoods or buildings with this sort of cast iron Renaissance inspired architecture. All right, so that ends our discussion of Italian Renaissance.